Today's online presentation focuses on the politics of Saskatchewan, featuring insights from Ken Rasmussen from University of Regina's Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. He is a foremost expert on Saskatchewan politics, public policy, and public administration, having worked in the civil service and researched and published widely on the subject. He earned his PhD from the University of Toronto, MPA from the University of Winnipeg, and BA from the University of Manitoba. I'd remind folks that are tuning in live or afterwards, please join us over at our blog at provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca if you have any questions for Ken now or after his talk. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ken. Thanks for joining us.
Great, thanks, Jared. This is one of the first times I've done this kind of a thing. I taught a course once online using Adobe Connect, and so I'm not entirely unfamiliar with it, but I thank people for their patience and allowing us to do this. It's an interesting way to do it, and I think it's, I guess, the future of education at some point. This isn't exactly a MOOC, not a massive online course or anything like that, but I'm glad that Jared is being innovative and creative with the technology and allowing you people to get the advantage of some colleagues from across the country. So yeah, Jared has given me about 20 minutes to talk to you about Saskatchewan politics, and it's a subject that I could go on ad nauseum for much longer than 20 minutes, but or 25 minutes, but I'll leave plenty of time for questions and so on after. And I think it's quite interesting, you know, that I'm giving a talk to people in Alberta who would be clearly familiar with some of the things in Saskatchewan, but not all. Certainly, you'd be more familiar with Saskatchewan politics than, let's say, you'd be familiar with Newfoundland politics or any of the Atlantic provinces. And I think that's from proximity. I would ask you if you know the name of the premier, but I suspect everybody in the audience knows of the legendary Brad Wall, who is Canada's most popular premier in terms of polling, and remains a very popular political figure in the province, and is in some ways reshaping the way politics is done in the province. And I'll talk a little bit about the contemporary issues in Saskatchewan in a minute. But I think it's important to point out that Saskatchewan has changed. And what's changed, I think, is the economy of the province. But there's always links to the politics as well, and the political economy of a province is going to have an impact, I think, on. It's an obvious impact on the politics. So Saskatchewan has changed much more than Alberta, although I think some of the things that have changed in Saskatchewan are similar to what has changed in Saskatchewan. And I think one of the major things is, in some sense, the decline of the agricultural economy and its replacement by a resource economy. But on top of that, a declining fear of Eastern Canada, particularly Quebec and Ontario, and the politics of Western separation and Western alienation, and the politics of grievances is in some sense, if not gone, at least attenuated at the present time. And I think that's really having a big transformation on how both Alberta and Saskatchewan see themselves within within the Canadian federal system. So I think that's an important thing to point out, that the old basis, and you can probably hear that there's a bit of a thunderstorm going on in Regina right now, and there's talk of a tornado too, but I don't think it's going to get to Regina, and I don't think we're going to have our broadcast interrupted because of inclement weather. I hope not, anyways. But if you hear the occasional crack of thunder, it's not the world coming to an end. Anyway, let me just talk a little bit about the previous Saskatchewan, and I think it's important to understand the the agrarian nature of Saskatchewan politics, as we see the growing, what I call the suburbanization of politics in Saskatchewan, and the real transformation of the power base in rural areas, and even the aspirations of rural farmers and for their families and so on, is more suburban than any time in the past. So what do I mean by the agrarian base? Well, you know, in Alberta and in Saskatchewan, certainly up to the 30s, 40s, and even the 50s, farmers had an incredible amount of political power. I mean, everybody basically did the same thing in Saskatchewan during that period of time, and that is they grew wheat. I mean, basically it was a monoculture, an agricultural monoculture in which small farmers all grew wheat and all had the same interests in terms of government policy. And that was similar in Alberta. And in fact, a reflection of that for everybody in Alberta will know that the farmers decided that they might as well just take over running of the province, in fact, and they formed a political party, United Farmers of Alberta, and in fact became the government of the province. And something similar happened in Saskatchewan, and that was the farmers basically took over the Liberal Party of Saskatchewan, and in fact the United Grain Growers and then the Saskatchewan Grain Growers had this incredibly similar membership to the Liberal Party, and so there was a very strong agricultural bent, as you might understand and you might guess. So for much of Saskatchewan's history, farmers have been the most powerful electoral group and whose support was needed for any political party to form a government. And in fact, various governments were very good at this. So the Liberals basically for 50 years or 40 years from 1905 when Saskatchewan became a province with Alberta until 1944, they were virtually a lock-on government. And then the CCF-NDP from 1944 until 1982 really catered to the rural needs and expectations of those groups, and that really shaped the nature of politics in Saskatchewan up until at least 1982, and even perhaps a bit later. But that doesn't mean that there were no changes that were occurring. I mean, clearly we saw the power of agriculture recede in Saskatchewan. And the kind of rural and collectivist political culture that had been created, particularly things like the very powerful co-op movement in the province, and so on. Those things really began to shift and change, and so we saw this decline in the role and the presence of small farmers, and all of their other attendant so organizations as well. I mean, we had the dismantling of the Crow rate, which was a bit of a battle in Saskatchewan, not as big as one might have assumed, but having to do with grain transportation. I'm not going to go into the details, but where they set the rate and the railways had to transport the grain at a price basically set in the 19th century. And so we had these things, these incredibly powerful institutions like the Canadian Wheat Board and the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, all of which are gone now, and all of the backbones of this have gone. And so we've had this real transformation in Saskatchewan. And one of the things that was important in this transformation was the way social democracy hitched its wagon, if you will, to this rural group. I mean, social democracy or socialism tended to be associated with urban areas, tended to be associated with industrialized provinces or industrialized countries, the UK and in particular, but Germany and elsewhere. But surprisingly, social democracy had a very strong presence in Saskatchewan for many decades, beginning with the Depression in the 1930s, and then really up until the 1990s. when we began to have a bit of a Tony Blair revolution with Roy Romano and the declining role of labor and farmers, and a new NDP, if you will, emerged in the 90s, which was much more of an urban middle class party, once again aimed at the growing suburban kind of a constituency. So you've had this real transformation in Saskatchewan. The declining influence of small farmers. We now have, as anybody in Alberta will be able to attest, based on the same phenomenon of a huge growth in the size of farms, massive farms. Now people are very capital intensive in their farming practices. Labor is shed every year in rural Saskatchewan, and so on. And so we also saw with the decline of this agricultural economy and many of these pillars, many of the notions of the old political culture, the Western alienation, regional discontent, the sense of grievances against particularly the business elite in Eastern Canada. And Saskatchewan politicians played on that. They played it like a fiddle for years and years, stoking fear of Ottawa, the need for a strong government in Saskatchewan that'll speak up for the province, fear that we're going to get continuously screwed by Quebec and Ontario, and so on. And so those things have gone, and largely, I mean, the reason why they've gone, I guess, are multiple, and they were leaving even before this latest this latest resource boom with potash and oil and gas and uranium and other minerals in northern Saskatchewan. But it really has changed dramatically, and so Saskatchewan is no longer a rural province. Most of the population lives in the two major cities, Saskatoon and Regina, plus some of the other smaller regional centers, Yorkton, Prince Albert, Moose Jaw, and so on. And so most people tend to be more urban than they have at any time in the past, and that's going. There is greater in-migration. We're no longer a have-not province either. We get equalization. We don't get equalization payments. And we're not as resentful of Eastern Canada either, or Quebec. I mean, Quebec separatism has become something that is not a source of concern anymore. And I think the sense that federal governments catering to Quebec aren't as big an issue. Now, that may change. I mean, I'm not saying that none of this can change, but certainly young Mr. Trudeau is doing all he can to convince Albertans, and to a lesser extent Saskatchewan residents, that they have nothing to worry, that he's not his father, and he's not going to create another national energy program, and so on. So what I mean. What I mean is that the changes have created a suburbanization of the province. That is, where, not unlike other parts of Canada, often the election is fought in the vote-rich suburbs. And in fact, in Saskatchewan, strangely, I think more symbolically than anything, the Wall government has added 3 new seats to the provincial legislature, in the suburban areas, representing opportunities for them because they do very well in those areas, but also recognizing the growth of the province, demonstrating to people that yes, we need to increase the size of the legislature because we are a growing province. There are more people coming here all the time, and so they are now absorbing new waves of immigrants. And the cities are now a political force. And in fact, the NDP's political support tends to be concentrated in the urban parts of cities, not in the suburban parts. And their vote tends to be concentrated amongst older people as well. whereas the growth in the province is obviously with younger, new immigrants. The classic, at least what we consider to be the classic kind of Harper voters, the people that are successfully wooed by small c conservative parties, or have been in the last decade or so, and they tend to be coming into Saskatchewan at high rates, and I think the Sask Party is doing a reasonably good job in converting them into Sask Party voters. So the economy is changing. The culture of the province is changing. The social democracy, like it is everywhere, frankly. I mean, it's not saying much to say that social democracy is a philosophy that is struggling to find a voice and finding a way to attract voters again. It hasn't been successful in many places for a while. I mean, I alluded to Tony Blair's transformation. Roy Romano tried to modernize the party, shifted away from its support of unions, and so on. But that really hasn't done much. It's something that is an ongoing project. And until the NDP in Saskatchewan figures out how to respond, they're in a tough position. So the province has gone from an agricultural province to a suburban province based on resources. The service sector has grown tremendously in the province. The resource sector has grown. And of course, it's meant that the current government has had the good fortune of being able to not have to make any tough decisions and lose much popularity with a variety of electoral constituencies. They've managed to be an incredibly high-spending conservative government, an irony that's not lost on the NDP, but there's little that they can do about it. So they have spent, like the proverbial drunken sailors. They haven't really exercised much fiscal restraint, and we'll see what happens when that occurs. But due to the boom in resource rents, they've been able to really offer a, for the most part, a pragmatic and well-managed government, and so on. So we're seeing we're seeing some changes in the province now. The old stable voting patterns are also changing as well, however, and the patterns certainly in the mid part of this century, in which small farmers and urban workers really rallied around the NDP, has changed, and there are emerging signs of a slight, or of a not of a slight, of a clear rural and urban split. However, it's not the same as other kinds of splits, I don't think, in the sense that I think when we think broadly about the political culture of Saskatchewan, I think it's safe to say that the value structure, the value system, is not that different between urban and rural voters. That is, they vote differently, not because of the red state, blue state kind of tensions that exist in the United States, but rather strategic voting based on appeals to different economic and other factors. I mean, frankly, that the Progressive Conservatives and now the Saskatchewan Party appeals to rural voters because they think that they will get more support for issues that are of concern to them, and basically they're right too. So, I mean, it would be hard to see a kind of a cultural battle. Certainly, Brad Wall has done everything in his power to maintain a very moderate, middle-of-the-road, pragmatic, centrist government in Saskatchewan. And if the NDP ever gets back into power, they will do the same thing. That is, that there isn't a Wild Rose Party in Saskatchewan. I mean, the Saskatchewan Party is not the Wild Rose Party, although it did replace the Progressive Conservative Party that collapsed under a variety of scandals in the 1990s, and I can certainly answer questions about that. But the Saskatchewan Party is not a party of. It's a coalition, frankly. It's made up of former reformers, members of the Progressive Conservative Party and Liberals. In fact, many of the prominent cabinet ministers, including the finance minister, Rod Gantafort, and other people up till recently, Rob Norris, and very high-profile ministers were former Liberals. So it was a coalition party, not unlike the Christy Clark Party in British Columbia. And I think that's an important thing to remember, too, that the Sask Party is not the Reform Party or anything like that. It's been able to create a kind of a different kind of government, coalition, if you will. People are always speculating about whether this will fall apart at some point, whether the Liberal Party will reemerge, and so on. It really doesn't look like it. Certainly as a provincial force, as a federal force, the Liberal Party is a distant third. The NDP is still the second choice in both provincial and federal politics in most constituencies. So let me just talk a little bit, if you will, about a couple of other things, and then I'll go to the question and answer period, if you will. So there has been a big transformation in the party system in Saskatchewan. The political parties have changed. We've had a period of Liberal Party domination. We've had a period of CCF domination, and we have now a period which is really, I guess, characterized by a period of Sask Party domination. It certainly looks like it, but it's a polarized two-party system in the province. I mean, there was often at periods of time two parties on the right in the province, the Liberals and the PCs, which fought for the so-called free enterprise vote, as it was referred to here in Saskatchewan. And the NDP could often win elections with much less than 50% of the popular vote, and they often did. With the collapse of the Liberals beginning in the 80s and just going right through the Trudeau era and a series of kind of self-inflicted wounds that the Liberal Party had, they have become virtually a spent force in the province of Saskatchewan. So now it's a two-party system, and people argue that really benefits the Sask Party and the party on the right, which always suffered. That is that people would say that Saskatchewan has always been a slightly more right-wing province, but it was always governed by left-of-center governments because of the split in the right vote. Now, I don't think that's entirely accurate, but nonetheless, this kind of unite the right effort, which took place with the collapse of the Progressive Conservatives, has been very successful, and I think it's an important development in the province's political history. Elections are competitive here too, though, and it sometimes even causes difficulties in working in the legislature. That is, it is a very highly charged legislative environment, and it always has been. I think the Saskatchewan Party is always worried about the NDP. The NDP have a history of governing, and while they may not have the same kind of machine that they had in the past, there was a time in the 1990s when they had upwards to 600,000 people, not active, but members of the party. Now that's a huge kind of mass party by contemporary standards, and this was in the 1990s. Now they've really come a long way down from those heady days, and they're struggling a bit as a political party, and as opposition parties often do. It's hard to get some traction. And opposition parties are often in disarray. The NDP, however, is got enough institutional memory and enough, frankly, institutional support throughout the province that they're not going to find themselves sidelined. And if there is a change in government, the NDP is always an alternative. I think if people ever decide that Brad Wall and the Sask Party have outworn their welcome. I mean, of course, when we think of problems in Saskatchewan and some of the difficulties that plague the province in terms of from a governance point of view, I mean, you have to mention the Aboriginal issue. Saskatchewan has a very, very large Aboriginal population in comparison to the overall population, much larger than Canada, much larger than almost any other province, and I think it is the largest the percentage of population upwards to, and I think over than 15%. Much of it lives off reserve, and so there are some of the attendant issues associated with this. People leaving crowded reserves and isolated communities and coming into the cities and making sure that they have the right skills and so on, and working with tribal councils. I mean, it's been a difficult thing for many governments, and the NDP were just as bad as any other party, and we've long struggled in Saskatchewan in finding an effective mechanism for dealing with these issues. There's now some interest in moving towards a system of revenue sharing. Certainly by the Aboriginal community there is, and I think at some point the government of Saskatchewan is going to come around to accept that a certain point, a certain number of tax points, if you will, or resource royalties, and are going to have to go directly to fund Aboriginal programs in the province. The other thing I just want to say about Saskatchewan, though, is for a variety of weird reasons, it has produced an incredibly rich body of secondary literature. So any of you that are considering papers on any province, I'm not sure what Wesley has in mind, but it's a great province to study because there's a huge amount that has been written about it by some of the greatest scholars. Just to mention, I couldn't not talk about Saskatchewan politics without mentioning at least the book by Seymour Martin Lipset called Agrarian Socialism, where I mean, as a New York intellectual, recently finished his PhD, he had heard about a government in this strange prairie province, Saskatchewan, that had elected a social democratic government, and he wanted to find out why. And he came here and he wrote this book, Agrarian Socialism, which was a study of the CCF in Saskatchewan, and it became a classic of political sociology and political science, and it's still referred to today, and it sparked a great deal of interest. So Saskatchewan, used to be this place that was a real rallying point for many on the left. It was seen as the place that was the first elected social democratic government in North America. It began all of these exciting innovations, an arts board, Medicare, of course, the use of crown corporations for resource development, and all kinds of things. It's no longer that, and we can lament that and talk about how sad it is, but nonetheless, Saskatchewan has changed. It's no longer a social democratic province. At the end of the day, it's a province much like others. So I'm happy. I hope that covered some of at least the high points and some of the issues around Saskatchewan. I'm happy to talk about anything that you want to talk about now.
Perfect. Thanks, Ken. We covered a lot of ground there. A lot of the questions that we're getting at the blog. Folks that want to tune in, provincialpolitics.blogspot.ca. A lot of them center around Saskatchewan's political culture, and I wonder if we could start with a discussion about the level of Western alienation. You touched on it very briefly at the beginning of your talk. A lot of the questions again from the blog center on that. I wonder, first of all, whether let's start with the assumption that Western alienation has declined in Saskatchewan. I think to a large extent, most observers would agree with you. How much of that is the product of the fact that there's a conservative government in Ottawa, as opposed to a real culture shift on a more long-term basis? That is to say that if the Liberals or the New Democrats came to power in Ottawa in 2015, that Western alienation wouldn't come alive again in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it would be I think interesting to see. Of course, it'd depend on where those governments get their support and all the rest. But let's assume that they get very little support from Western Canada, and they become a national government, which was the case for many decades. Yeah, I mean, I think that certainly it wouldn't be beyond the reasonable scope for a provincial politician to start playing that card again. I think certainly the NDP were still playing it as late as 2005, and trying to fiddle with the equalization system, and saying we were still being screwed by Ottawa. And there was a case that we were maybe being shortchanged on our equalization payments, but yeah. So you're right. There's a difference between an end to that kind of politics and this temporary accommodation between the Sask Party and the Harper government. And there's clearly no question that those two parties have been very simpatico, although they have disagreed. Certainly Premier Wall was clear, for example, on a strange issue about the takeover of the Potash Corporation, where he basically forced the federal government's hand in preventing an American company from buying what was essentially another American company. One just happened to be called the Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan, but it's a largely American company now. Anyway, but so he had issues with that, and he forced the Prime Minister to back down on that, and so I think there is a sense that we have a little clout, and so your question is this likely to change with changes in electoral? On the one hand, yes, I think you're right, and on the other hand, though, I do think something has shifted. That I think there's less a sense that I mean it's been a long time coming, whether it was NAFTA and the end of the Crow rate and all this, but our fortunes are less tied to the decisions that are made in Ottawa. That is that are, strangely enough, our economy may still be out of our hands. That is, it's subject to decisions that are being made in Beijing and in Washington and other places, but the same sense of resentment isn't there because they're not decisions made by our political system. So I think there has been a change where we used to always see the problems, whether rightly or wrongly, as meddling by Ottawa or some disservice. Ottawa has taken away a lot of those things. Frankly, by getting rid of the wheat board, by getting rid of trade barriers, by making it easier for Saskatchewan and resource provinces to export their products, and all of that. So I think the tools, the levers that the federal government has are less present. So I think the answer is a bit of both. I don't think that we'll see the return to the same kind of vitriolic Western separatism that we saw in the past, because Ottawa had a lot of cards that it was playing. Now it doesn't have those same cards, or it's abandoned a lot of them with various trade agreements and with getting rid of certain crown corporations and so on.
Yeah, I'd agree with you largely. I think that there have been some flashpoints on things like temporary foreign workers, or on not moving quickly enough on to address rail volume shortages and so on. But for the most part, I'd agree with you that impulse of Western alienation isn't as strong in Saskatchewan as it has been historically.
Yeah, it's not what people go to first, it was the knee-jerk political reaction here.
No, it was, and I don't know whether there's any parallels between that and the way things were in the 1980s when Saskatchewan and Ottawa governments were governed by the same party or not.
There was a bit of that, actually, and in fact, although it was kind of odd, because, and in fact there is a famous election in which was sort of won because of a giant agricultural bailout by Brian Mulroney at that time to Grant Devine, which really helped him solidify his support in the province. One-time huge, $500 million or something, which was a lot of money at that time for farmers. So yeah, there is that issue of the simpatico, the links between the two parties. The NDP always had it good because no matter who was in power in Ottawa, they would always have an enemy in Ottawa.
Okay, and you also, just switching gears a bit here, you also mentioned at the tail end of your talk about First Nations politics being being a prominent or a growing feature of Saskatchewan politics. I know it's there are people who spend their entire academic careers on this, and I know you're not necessarily one of them, but if we could just touch on that just briefly. Statistics show, at least according to the question I've got on the blog here, this is worth fact checking, but I'm going to assume it's true. Saskatchewan's First Nations population is set to become the demographic majority by 2050. That's a long way out, but I think we would be on safe ground in saying that it certainly will be one of the larger demographic forces in the province. Do you foresee that translating into political clout? And if so, how would that change the dynamic of Saskatchewan politics, or party politics in particular?
Well, I mean, I wish it would, but it's a sad story. The lack of engagement that essentially both political parties have had with the Aboriginal community in Saskatchewan. I mean, there are some ridings in the north that are obviously predominantly Aboriginal, but both of them have had a very fraught and very contested history with the leadership, at least of Aboriginal organizations in the province. That is, and in fact, the Aboriginal organizations have wanted less to do as well. They're more interested in their own governance issues, frankly, than getting involved in Saskatchewan electoral politics. Which is of course a problem. I mean, they have such a vast amount of governance responsibilities on reserve and so on, and that takes most of the leadership talent, if you will, away from partisan politics in Saskatchewan. So I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed at some point. But it doesn't look very promising. I hate to sound pessimistic, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of will on the part of either political party in the province to really make an honest effort to deal with the problems. And of course it involves money. And frankly, the Sask party has occasionally really stoked things and has bordered on what, for lack of a better word, might be kind of racially charged policies, particularly with regards to resource revenues. They've been very aggressive in saying that they're not going to negotiate on the resource, that everybody in Saskatchewan gets access to Saskatchewan-funded programs, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, it plays into the politics of the province, but it isn't as prominent as it probably should be, and indeed, you kind of worry that with rising numbers of immigrants in the province that are less interested in this kind of an issue, not that, or they're less aware, I should perhaps put it, that it can be sidelined in the electoral map anyway. And I hope that doesn't happen. You'd really feel that there is now, particularly with the booming economy, real opportunities, and there's so much great leadership and so many great things that are happening in Aboriginal communities. One hopes that the governments won't lose sight of that and will take advantage of both the time and as I said, the great leadership opportunities and the great leadership that's been shown from many of the Aboriginal communities.
Great. Thanks, Ken. One final question for you, and I always hated when I was put on the spot as a political scientist with a question like this, but let's peer into our crystal ball if we could. I remember hearing about polls that were in Saskatchewan saying that Brad Wall is actually more popular, or his approval rating is higher than God's. They actually did ask the question, who do you trust more with some issues, God or Brad Wall? And he was polling consistently higher than God himself. So. Given that, and given the success of the Sask Party over the last decade, what's it going to take? And you suggested that the New Democrats are the government in waiting. I guess my question is, how long is that going to take? And what would they have to do in order to change their fortunes and possibly shift power out of the hands of the Sask Party?
Well, that's a good question, and people are always asking that question in Saskatchewan. I mean, what's going to happen to the NDP, or have we entered a new era of dynastic politics like in Alberta, where the Sask Party will now rule forever and just keep changing leaders? Well, I don't think so. I think a lot of this actually is, a lot of the success of the Sask Party is due to the Premier, who consistently polls ahead of the party, who has struck an amazingly populist tone right across the province. I mean, there's very few people that dislike him, other than real NDP partisans. And he's a very popular figure, and so now, when he leaves, and whenever he leaves, things are going to change, because whoever comes in, I mean, there's nobody that really shines as bright as he does. There's no second fiddle. There's no leader in waiting or anything like that. Everybody in the Sask Party, all the cabinet, are very cautious about saying anything that might even hint at a leadership change or dissatisfaction. There's certainly none of that. I mean, when the Sask Party holds a premier's dinner, it is a love-in and of almost unbelievable proportions. I mean, so he's a very popular guy. So, but that said, once he leaves, I think it does become a different electoral landscape. The NDP have essentially decided, well, if they can't beat them, let's join them, and they've elected basically their own Brad Wall. That is a young, photogenic, but folksy and kind of charming person as the leader of the NDP in Cambroton, and he's been on the job about 14 or 15 months now, and there's beginning to be some vague movement, not a great deal, but nonetheless, I think he's got a high likability factor, whatever that means, or however that translates into politics. Now, there is, however, the Sask Party also is not a party of old fogies either. It's got a lot of very young and competent cabinet ministers in Dustin Duncan and Tim McClellan and a variety of people like that could be credible leaders, but it would be a much more fair contest, I think, at that point, between the NDP and the Sask Party. I think Brad Wall just has a rapport with the people of the province. I mean, he's the #1 Ryder fan, which, of course, I think is the key thing you have to do in the province, and he sort of has branded himself and the Riders in this kind of mystical union. Pointing out that the Rough Riders never won a Grey Cup when the NDP or CCF was in power, and so anyway, he's used those kinds of things very effectively to brand himself as Mr. Saskatchewan. So he's going to be a tough guy, and I basically say, when people ask me this question, I guess this is a long way of saying it, that the NDP aren't going to defeat Brad Wall. Or the Sask Party, when Brad Wall is still a leader of the Sask Party. They're going to have to wait. And there's always vague rumors that he's thinking of leaving. I mean, he has joked, but I don't think that seriously about becoming the commissioner of the CFL. There's always rumors that he's going to take over from Gary Doer as Canada's ambassador to the United States, something that he's actually admitted he would like to do. So if the NDP, ironically, can get some help from Stephen Harper in terms of getting an appointment for Brad Wall, then they're going to be in a much better place. I think they're just holding on. They have a young leader now, so there's no real hurry for him to become premier. In the previous election, they had an old warhorse, Dwayne Lingenfelter, who was back from the old era of the NDP, and he was all negative all the time and a real pit bull, and that really didn't go over big with people. I mean, he just struck the wrong tone, and so I think they've entered a better tone, at least in terms of what people want from their political leaders in this province. And so I think that they're just going to have to wait out Brad Wall. I mean, he can be the premier essentially as long as he wants, would be my expectation.
Well, with that, Ken, we're out of time. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. We got a great look inside of Saskatchewan politics. I'll have to tell you that also a lot of themes you mentioned, including the suburbanization, of Saskatchewan politics is something that we see popping up across the rest of the country. So for those folks that are tuning in, you may want to check out the rest of the YouTube channel for what was talked about in particular in Manitoba and in Ontario and nearby provinces. So thanks, Ken, for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure. It was fun doing this.
Great. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Okay, good. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.